You are listening to HOA Rulebook. The HOA tried to weaponize winter. Your driveway is obstructing snow removal, and the TOW is authorized. Vanessa Stewart stormed up my porch steps at 6 in the morning, jabbing her phone at me while her breath came out in angry clouds. She planted herself on the second step, blocking my path to my car, and announced I had 15 minutes to move my vehicle or she would call the contractor herself. Her phone was mounted on a gimbal rig, filming everything, and she held a clipboard under her arm with a notice already filled out. I am a building maintenance technician in Annapolis, Maryland, and I know every rule and every loophole in the Millstone Terrace Association covenant. My job starts at 7:30 sharp, and a snow emergency tow would get me fired because I cannot take the bus from here. I need my car. Vanessa knows that. She has known it since the day I moved in and submitted my work schedule with my parking permit application. She said, "I decide what counts as cleared, not you." I looked at my steps. I had salted them the night before. The salt had melted most of the ice, leaving wet patches and a little slush at the edges. There was no ice sheet, no hazard. Vanessa pointed at a spot near the railing where a thin rime had formed overnight and said that was a violation of the emergency snow safety protocol, and she was citing me for failure to maintain common safety unless I cleared it while she watched. I said, "That is not a common area. These are my steps." She said, "The covenant defines any exterior surface visible from the street as subject to community standards during a snow emergency, and your steps are visible. So they are subject." I said, "Show me that language." She tapped her clipboard and said, "It is in the winter addendum." I said, "I read the winter addendum." "It does not say that." She said, "Then you read it wrong." I pulled my phone out and opened my photos. I had taken a picture of my steps at 11 the night before, right after I salted them, with a timestamp visible in the corner. I had also taken a picture at 5:50 this morning when I came outside to warm up my car. Both pictures showed clear wet steps with no ice sheet. I turned the screen toward her and said, "I have photos." She glanced at the screen and said, "Your camera does not matter. My minutes are the truth." I did not argue. I wrote down the time, 6:14, and her exact words in my notepad. The pages were damp from the snow, but I could still read my handwriting. Vanessa noticed and said, "What are you writing?" I said, "Notes." She said, "You cannot use notes against the association." I said, "I can use anything I want in a hearing." She said, "There will not be a hearing, because you are going to comply right now." I said, "I am not shoveling dry salt off wet concrete because you do not like the look of it." She said, "Then your car gets towed." I said, "Under what authority?" She said, "The emergency snow protocol gives the landscaping committee full discretion to clear obstructions, and your driveway is obstructing the plow path." I looked at my driveway. My car was parked inside my garage. The driveway was empty except for a light dusting of snow that had fallen after I cleared it at midnight. The plow had not even come down our street yet. Vanessa pulled a folded notice from her clipboard and tried to wedge it into my storm door. I blocked her hand and said, "You are not allowed to enter my porch without permission." She said, "I am not entering. I am posting a notice." I said, "You are standing on my steps without permission." She said, "These steps are a safety hazard and I am required to document them." I said, "You are trespassing." She said, "You cannot trespass an HOA officer performing her duties." I took a step back inside and said, "I am going to work. If you want to tow my car, you can try, but I will dispute it and I will win." She said, "You will not win because I have the authority and you do not." I said, "Your authority does not override the law." She said, "The covenant is the law here." I closed the door and locked it. She stood outside for another 2 minutes, filming my door, then walked back to her car and sat in the driver's seat with the engine running. She did not leave. She was waiting to see if I would try to go to work. I watched her through my front window. My shift started in 45 minutes. I needed to leave in 10 minutes to make it on time. If I walked out and she followed through on her threat, I would lose my car and my job. If I called in sick, I would burn a sick day and she would know she could force me to stay home anytime she wanted. I did not have a third option unless I could prove she was bluffing, or unless I could prove she did not have the authority she claimed. I opened my laptop and pulled up the Millstone Terrace Association covenant. I searched for every reference to snow, ice, emergency, and landscaping. The winter addendum was 3 pages long. It required homeowners to clear driveways and walkways within 24 hours of snowfall. It required homeowners to salt icy patches that posed a hazard to pedestrians. It gave the landscaping committee the right to inspect properties and issue compliance notices. It did not give the landscaping committee the right to tow vehicles. It did not define driveways as obstructions. It did not define steps as common areas. I screenshotted every relevant section and emailed them to myself with a timestamp. Then I called the management company. The voicemail said they opened at 8. I left a message explaining that Vanessa Stewart had threatened to tow my car under a snow emergency protocol that did not exist in the covenant, and that I needed clarification on her authority before I left for work. I said I would follow up in writing. I hung up and checked the time. 6:32. I had to leave now, or I would be late. I grabbed my work bag, my notepad, and my phone. I walked out the front door and locked it behind me. Vanessa was still in her car. She saw me and got out immediately. She walked across the street toward my driveway, holding her phone up to film. I walked to my car and opened the driver's door. She said, "You are leaving without clearing your obstruction." I said, "There is no obstruction." She said, "I just documented one." I got in my car and started the engine. Vanessa walked up to my driver's side window and knocked on the glass. I did not roll it down. She said, "If you leave, I will authorize the tow." I said through the closed window, "You do not have that authority." She said, "I do." I said, "Show me in writing." She held up her clipboard and pointed at a line I could not read through the glass. I said, "I cannot read that." She said, "Then stay here until you can." I said, "I have to go to work." She said, "Then you accept the consequences." I reversed out of my driveway slowly, making sure I did not come close to hitting her. She stepped back but kept filming. I drove past her and turned onto the main road. She stood in the street, still filming until I was out of sight. I checked my mirrors. She was not following me. I exhaled and turned the heat up. My hands were shaking. I did not know if she would actually call a tow truck or if she was just trying to intimidate me, but I knew I could not let her think the threat worked. I got to work at 7:28. I clocked in and went straight to my supervisor to explain what had happened. He listened and said, "Do you have proof?" I showed him the photos, the covenant screenshots, and my notepad with the timeline. He said, "If your car gets towed, let me know immediately and we will work something out, but I cannot give you extra time off unless it is an actual emergency." I said, "Understood." He said, "Keep documenting everything." I said, "I am. If you are dealing with HOA overreach or just love watching Karens lose, hit that like button and subscribe so you do not miss the next story." I worked my full shift. I checked my phone every hour to see if Vanessa had left a message or if the management company had called back. Nothing. At 3 in the afternoon, I got a text from my next-door neighbor. It was a photo of a white pickup truck parked in front of my house with a magnetic sign on the door that said Snow Compliance Verification. No company name, no phone number. Just those 3 words. My neighbor said, this guy knocked on your door and then walked around your driveway with a tape measure. He took pictures. He left 5 minutes ago. I texted back, did he leave a notice? My neighbor said no, but he talked to Vanessa for a while. She was standing in her driveway watching him. I said, thanks for the heads up. My neighbor said, this is getting weird. I said, I know. I called the management company again. This time someone answered. I said, I need to speak to someone about Vanessa Stewart and a threatened tow. The person on the phone said, are you a homeowner at Millstone Terrace? I said yes. She said, hold please. I waited. A man picked up and said, this is Derek, property manager. What is the issue? I said, Vanessa Stewart threatened to tow my car this morning under a snow emergency protocol that does not exist in the covenant, and now someone showed up at my house claiming to verify snow compliance. I need to know if the association authorized that. Derek said, let me check. I heard keyboard typing. He said, I do not have any record of a tow authorization or a vendor dispatched to your address today. I said, so Vanessa sent someone on her own. He said, I cannot speak to that without reviewing the situation. I said, I left you a voicemail this morning explaining the threat. He said, I have not checked voicemail yet. I said, can you check it now? He said, I will review it and get back to you by end of business. I said, that is not good enough. If she tows my car tonight, I lose my job. He said, I understand your concern, but I need time to investigate. I said, how much time? He said, 48 hours. I said, that is 2 days. He said, that is our standard response window. I said, this is not standard. He said, I will do my best. He hung up. I finished my shift and drove home. I took a different route so I could pass by the HOA office and see if Vanessa's car was there. It was not. I drove to my street and parked in my driveway. I got out and checked my steps. They looked the same as they had that morning. Wet, mostly clear, a little slush at the edges. I checked my driveway. The snow dusting had been disturbed in a few places, probably from the so-called compliance verification guy walking around. I took new photos with timestamps and added them to my records. I went inside and made dinner. At 7, I got an email from the Millstone Terrace Association portal. The subject line said, Violation Notice, Final Warning. I opened it. The body of the email said I had failed to comply with the emergency snow safety protocol and that I was being fined $250. The fine was due in 10 days. If I did not pay, the association would place a lien on my property and escalate enforcement actions. The notice was signed by Vanessa Stewart, Landscaping Committee Lead. I took a screenshot. I logged into the portal to check my violation history. There was nothing. No prior notices, no prior fines, no prior warnings. The email said final warning, but there had been no first warning. I opened the portal documents section and searched for the emergency snow safety protocol. It was not there. I searched for the winter addendum. It was there, but it did not mention anything about final warnings or $250 fines for steps. I drafted a reply. I attached the covenant screenshots, the photo timestamps, and a paragraph explaining that I had cleared my steps and driveway as required and that Vanessa's interpretation of the rules was incorrect. I submitted it through the portal. The system gave me a confirmation number. I saved it. Then I checked the sent items folder. My submission was there, timestamped 7:42. I checked again 10 minutes later. It was gone. The sent items folder was empty. I refreshed the page. Still empty. I checked my email to see if I had gotten a confirmation. Nothing. I logged out and logged back in. The sent items folder was still empty. I took a screenshot of the empty folder with the timestamp visible. Then I checked the violation notice again. It was still there, unchanged. I opened my email and forwarded the violation notice to my personal email address so I would have a copy outside the portal. Then I forwarded it to the management company with a note explaining that my rebuttal had disappeared from the portal and asking them to investigate. Derek did not reply that night. I did not sleep well. I kept expecting to hear a tow truck outside. At 4 in the morning, I got up and looked out the window. My car was still there. Vanessa's car was in her driveway with the lights off. I went back to bed and set an alarm for 5:30 so I could check my steps before she had a chance to show up again. At 5:30, I went outside with my phone and my notepad. My steps were clear. I had not salted them again because I did not need to. The overnight temperature had stayed above freezing, and the remaining slush had melted. I took photos. I checked my driveway. Also clear. I took more photos. Then I heard a car door. I looked up. Vanessa was walking across the street toward me, holding her phone on the gimbal and carrying a portable folding sign stand under her other arm. She set the sign stand down at the edge of my driveway, facing the street. The sign had no readable text, but it was clearly meant to mark something. She said, "You are in violation of the snow removal timeline." I said, "There is no snow to remove." She said, "You failed to remove snow from your driveway within 24 hours of the last snowfall." I said, "It has been 36 hours since the last snowfall and I removed it 12 hours after it stopped." She said, "The timeline starts when the snow starts, not when it stops." I said, "That is not what the covenant says." She said, "I interpret the covenant." I said, "You do not have that authority." She said, "I am the landscaping committee lead and I have full discretion during a snow emergency." I said, "This is not a snow emergency." She said, "The county issued a snow advisory yesterday." I said, "An advisory is not an emergency." She said, "The covenant does not distinguish between advisories and emergencies." I said, "Yes, it does." "Show me where it says you can fine me for steps that are not icy." She said, "I already showed you this morning." I said, "No, you did not. You held up a clipboard. I never saw the actual text." She said, "That is not my problem." I said, "I am not paying a fine for a violation I did not commit." She said, "Then we will proceed with enforcement actions." I said, "What enforcement actions?" She said, "The board has authorized a lien and a compliance escort." I said, "What is a compliance escort?" She said, "A contractor who will perform the work you failed to perform and bill you for it." I said, "There is no work to perform." She said, "There is snow on your property." I said, "There is not." She pointed at the edge of my lawn where a thin line of snow remained along the fence. I said, "That is not part of the driveway." She said, "It is part of your property and it is visible from the street, so it falls under the winter maintenance standards." I said, "Show me that standard in writing." She said, "I already told you, it is in the winter addendum." I said, "I read the winter addendum, and it does not say that." She said, "Then you need to read it again." I pulled my phone out and opened my copy of the winter addendum. I scrolled to the section on driveway maintenance. I read it out loud. The section said homeowners must clear driveways and walkways of snow and ice within 24 hours of accumulation. It did not mention lawns. It did not mention fences. It did not mention anything visible from the street. I turned the phone toward her and said, "This is what it says." She glanced at the screen and said, "That is an outdated version." I said, "This is the version on the portal." She said, "The portal is not always current." I said, "Then where is the current version?" She said, The board has it. I said, then I need a copy. She said, you can request one at the next board meeting. I said, when is the next board meeting? She said, 3 weeks. I said, that is not acceptable. She said, that is the process. I did not respond. I wrote down the time, 5:54, and her statement about the portal being outdated. Vanessa watched me write and said, stop writing things down. I said no. She said, you are creating a hostile record. I said, I am documenting your statements. She said, you are harassing me. I said, you are standing on my property at 6 in the morning threatening me with fines I do not owe. She said, I am performing my duties as an HOA officer. I said, your duties do not include making up rules. She said, I am not making up rules. She turned and walked back to her car. She got in and sat there for 5 minutes, then drove away. I finished taking my photos and went inside. I forwarded the new photos to the management company with another email explaining what had just happened. I said Vanessa had placed a sign on my property without permission and had claimed the portal version of the winter addendum was outdated. I asked for a copy of the current version and a clarification of her authority. I sent the email at 6:07. Derek replied at 9:30. He said he had reviewed my messages and that he would schedule a conference call with me and Vanessa to resolve the issue. He said the call would happen within the next 5 business days. I replied and said that was not fast enough because Vanessa had already threatened enforcement actions, including a lien and a compliance escort. I said I needed a written statement of her authority before the end of the day. Derek replied and said he could not provide that without consulting the board. I said, how long will that take? He said the board meets next week. I said, that is not acceptable. He did not reply. I called a friend who works in property management in Baltimore. I explained the situation and asked if Vanessa's behavior was legal. My friend said it sounded like harassment and that I should document everything and consider consulting an attorney. I said, I do not want to hire an attorney for an HOA dispute. My friend said, you might not have a choice if she keeps escalating. I said, can she actually place a lien over a $250 fine? My friend said, technically yes, but she has to follow the correct procedure and give you a chance to dispute it first. I said, she did not give me a chance. My friend said, then you have grounds to challenge it. I said, how? My friend said, file a formal complaint with the board and the management company. If that does not work, take it to small claims court. I said, thanks. My friend said, good luck. You are going to need it. I drafted a formal complaint. I attached every photo, every email, every screenshot, and a typed timeline of Vanessa's actions. I submitted it through the portal and sent a copy to Derek directly. I also sent a copy to the board president whose email I found on the HOA website. I did not expect a response, but I wanted a record that I had tried to resolve this through official channels. At 2 in the afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered. A man said, this is Brad from Compliance Solutions. I am calling about your snow removal issue at Millstone Terrace. I said, I do not have a snow removal issue. He said, I have a work order here that says you need your driveway cleared. I said, who sent you the work order? He said, the HOA. I said, which person at the HOA? He said, I do not have a name, just a reference number. I said, I do not authorize any work. He said, the work order says it is a compliance action. I said, I am not in violation. He said, I am just doing my job. I said, if you come to my property, I will call the police. He said, that is your choice. He hung up. I looked out my window. There was a white pickup truck parked at the curb. Brad got out and walked toward my driveway. He was carrying a snow shovel and a bag of salt. I grabbed my phone and my notepad and went outside. I said, "Stop." He said, "I have a work order." I said, "I did not authorize it." He said, "The HOA authorized it." I said, "Show me the work order." He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and held it up. I took a photo of it. The paper had a reference number and my address, but no signature and no contact information. I said, "This is not valid." He said, "It is valid enough for me." I said, "If you touch my property, I will sue you." He said, "Lady at the HOA said you would say that." I said, "Then she should have told you I mean it." Brad looked at me, then at the paper, then back at me. He said, "I am not getting in the middle of this." He walked back to his truck and got in. He sat there for a minute, then drove away. I watched him go. Then I called Derek and left another message. I said Vanessa had sent a contractor to my house with a fake work order and that I had refused service. I said if she tried this again, I would involve the police. I hung up and went back inside. At 4, I got an email from the board president. It said, "We have received your complaint and we will address it at the next board meeting." I replied and said the next board meeting was 3 weeks away and that Vanessa's actions were creating an immediate problem. I said I needed a resolution now. The board president replied and said, "We do not handle individual disputes outside of scheduled meetings." I said, "This is not an individual dispute, this is harassment." The board president did not reply. I called my friend again. I said, "The board will not do anything." My friend said, "Then you need to escalate outside the HOA." I said, "To who?" My friend said, "The city." HOAs have to follow city ordinances, and if Vanessa is misrepresenting a city rule, the city will care. I said, "How do I prove she is misrepresenting a rule?" My friend said, "Call the city clerk and ask for a copy of the actual ordinance. If it does not match what she is claiming, you have her." I said, "That is good." My friend said, "And if the city gets involved, the HOA will back down fast because they do not want fines." I said, "Thanks." I hung up and called the Annapolis city clerk. The city clerk answered. I explained that I needed a copy of the snow removal ordinance. The clerk said, "Is this for a city property or an HOA property?" I said, "HOA." The clerk said, "HOAs have their own rules." I said, "I know, but the HOA is claiming the city ordinance requires something it does not, and I need proof." The clerk said, "What specifically are they claiming?" I said, "They are saying driveways are obstructions to snow removal and that homeowners can be towed under a city emergency protocol." The clerk said, "That is not accurate." I said, "Can you send me something in writing that says that?" The clerk said, "I can send you the ordinance and a clarification letter." I said, "How long will that take?" The clerk said, 2 business days. I said, "That works." The clerk took my email address and said, "You should receive it by Friday." I said, "Thank you." The clerk said, "Good luck with your HOA." I did not play my hand yet, and she thought that meant I had none. That was fine. Let her think that. Let her keep escalating. The more she did, the more evidence I had. The more evidence I had, the harder she would fall when I finally used it. On Thursday, Vanessa left another notice on my door. This one said I had been scheduled for a compliance hearing on Monday at 6 in the evening at the HOA office. Attendance was mandatory. Failure to attend would result in automatic enforcement. I took a photo of the notice and added it to my records. Then I emailed Derek and said I had not been given proper notice for a hearing and that I needed at least 7 days under the covenant dispute resolution procedures. Derek replied and said the hearing was an informal review, not a formal dispute hearing, so the 7-day rule did not apply. I replied and said the notice called it a compliance hearing, which was listed in the covenant as a formal proceeding. Derek did not reply. On Friday, the city clerk emailed me the snow removal ordinance and a one-page clarification letter. The ordinance said homeowners were required to clear sidewalks within 48 hours of snowfall. It said driveways were private property and were not subject to city enforcement. It said vehicles could only be towed from public streets during declared snow emergencies and only by city-authorized contractors. The clarification letter said the city had not declared a snow emergency this season and that HOAs did not have the authority to authorize tows under city ordinance. I saved both documents and forwarded them to Derek, the board president, in my personal email. I did not send them to Vanessa. Not yet. I wanted to see how far she would go. On Monday, I left work early so I could get to the HOA office by 6. I brought a folder with printed copies of everything: the photos, the timeline, the covenant sections, the city ordinance, the clarification letter, and a typed statement summarizing my position. I also brought a portable audio recorder. I did not know if I would be allowed to record the hearing, but I was going to try. I got to the HOA office at 5:50. The office was in a small commercial building near the neighborhood entrance. Vanessa's car was already in the parking lot. I parked and went inside. The reception area was empty. There was a hallway with 3 doors. One door had a sign that said conference room. I walked to the door and opened it. Vanessa was sitting at the head of a long table. Derek was sitting to her right. 2 other people I did not recognize were sitting on the left side of the table. No one else was there. Vanessa said, "You are late." I checked my watch. It was 5:53. I said, "The notice said 6. She said, "We start on time." I said, "It is not 6 yet." She said, "Sit down." I sat at the far end of the table. Vanessa said, "This is a compliance hearing regarding your failure to maintain snow safety standards." I said, "I would like to record this." She said, "No." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because I said no." I said, "The covenant does not prohibit recording." She said, "This is not a formal hearing." I said, "You called it a compliance hearing." She said, "It is an informal review." I said, "Then why am I required to attend?" She said, "Because you are in violation." Derek cleared his throat and said, "Let us go through the facts." Vanessa said, "The facts are clear. He failed to clear his steps, he failed to clear his driveway, and he refused compliance assistance." I said that is not accurate. Vanessa said, "I have documentation." She opened a binder and pulled out a stack of photos. She slid them across the table toward Derek. I leaned forward to see. The photos showed my steps and driveway from various angles. In every photo, there was snow or ice visible. But the snow in the photos was heavier than what I had actually seen. The ice was thicker. The timestamps on the photos were different from mine. I said those photos are not from my property. Vanessa said yes, they are. I said, no, they are not. The timestamps do not match. She said, I took them myself. I said, when? She said, over the last week. I pulled out my own folder and opened it. I slid my photos across the table. I said, these are my photos with timestamps. You can see the conditions were not what you were claiming. Derek picked up both sets of photos and compared them. He said, these do not match. Vanessa said, his photos are edited. I said, no, they are not. The metadata is intact. Vanessa said, metadata can be faked. I said, so can photos. Vanessa said, I am an HOA officer. I do not fake photos. I said, you just lied about the timestamps. Derek said, let us move on. Vanessa said, he is deflecting. Derek said, we need to establish the facts first. One of the other people at the table said, can I say something? Vanessa said, no. The person said, I am a board member and I have a right to speak. Vanessa said, this is my hearing. The board member said, it is a board hearing. Vanessa said, I am running it. The board member said, you cannot run a hearing you are involved in. Vanessa said, I am the landscaping committee lead. The board member said, that does not give you the authority to adjudicate your own complaint. Vanessa said, this is not a complaint, it is a compliance review. The board member said, it is the same thing. Vanessa said, no, it is not. Derek said, let us take a break. Derek stood up and walked out of the room. Vanessa glared at the board member. The board member said, you are out of line. Vanessa said, you are undermining the committee. The board member said, you are abusing your role. Vanessa said, I am enforcing the rules. The board member said, you are making up rules. Vanessa said, I decide what counts as cleared, not you. The board member said, that is exactly the problem. Derek came back into the room. He said, I just spoke to the board president. This hearing is suspended until we can review the procedural issues. Vanessa said, what procedural issues? Derek said, you cannot preside over a hearing involving your own complaint. Vanessa said, this is not a complaint. Derek said, it is close enough. Vanessa said, I have the authority. Derek said, not for this. Vanessa said, then who does? Derek said, the board president. Vanessa said, he is not here. Derek said, then we reschedule. Vanessa said no. Derek said yes. Vanessa stood up and said, this is unacceptable. Derek said, it is what it is. Vanessa grabbed her binder and walked out. The board member looked at me and said, I am sorry you had to go through that. I said, thank you. The board member said, she has been out of control for months. I said, why has no one stopped her? The board member said, the board president does not want conflict. I said, this is conflict. The board member said, I know. I said, what happens now? The board member said, we will reschedule the hearing with proper procedure. I said, how long? The board member said, probably 2 weeks. I said, she threatened to tow my car. The board member said, she cannot do that. I said, she already tried. The board member said, if she tries again, call the police. I said, I will. I left the office and went to my car. Vanessa was sitting in her car in the parking lot watching me. I ignored her and drove home. When I got home, I checked my email. Derek had sent a message saying the hearing had been suspended and would be rescheduled. He said he would send a new notice within 5 business days. I replied and said I wanted the new hearing conducted by an impartial party, not Vanessa. Derek did not reply that night. On Tuesday, I woke up to find a notice taped to my car windshield. It said my vehicle was parked in violation of the snow emergency vehicle restrictions and that I had 24 hours to move it or it would be towed. I checked the date on the notice. It was dated Monday, the day of the hearing, but it had not been on my windshield when I got home Monday night. Vanessa had put it there overnight. I took a photo of the notice with a timestamp and checked my car. It was parked in my driveway, exactly where it was supposed to be. There was no snow emergency. The county had not issued any new advisories. I called Derek. He answered. I said, Vanessa left a fake tow notice on my car overnight. Derek said, how do you know it is fake? I said, because there is no snow emergency, and my car is parked on my own property. Derek said, let me look into it. I said, how long? Derek said, I will call you back today. I said, if my car gets towed, I am suing the HOA and Vanessa personally. Derek said, I understand. He hung up. At 10, I got a call from an unknown number. I answered. A man said, this is Rick from Suburban Towing. I have an authorization to tow a vehicle at your address. I said, from who? He said Millstone Terrace Association. I said, that authorization is fake. He said, I have the paperwork. I said the paperwork is fraudulent. He said, I am just doing my job. I said, if you tow my car, I will report you to the city and sue your company. He said, lady, I do not want trouble. I said, then do not tow my car. He said, I need to talk to my dispatcher. He hung up. I went outside. A tow truck was parked at the end of my driveway. Rick was standing next to it talking on his phone. I walked up to him and said, do not touch my car. He said, I am waiting for confirmation. I said, confirmation of what? He said that the authorization is valid. I said, it is not valid. Show me the paperwork. He pulled a folded form from his clipboard and held it up. I took a photo. The form had the HOA name, my address, and a reference number. It was signed by Vanessa Stewart. It did not have a date. It did not have a board seal. I said, this is not a valid authorization. He said, it looks valid to me. I said, it is missing required information. He said, like what? I said, a date and a board seal. He looked at the form and said, I do not know about that. I said, call the management company and ask. Rick called his dispatcher again. He said, the homeowner is saying the authorization is not valid. The dispatcher said something I could not hear. Rick said, he is saying it is missing a date and a seal. The dispatcher said something else. Rick said, okay. He hung up and said, my dispatcher says we cannot proceed without a valid authorization. I am leaving. He got in his truck and drove away. I watched him go, then went back inside and called Derek again. Derek answered. I said, a tow truck just showed up at my house with fake paperwork signed by Vanessa. Derek said, what? I said, a tow truck. With an authorization signed by Vanessa. It did not have a date or a seal. The driver left when I pointed that out. Derek said, I did not authorize that. I said, then Vanessa did it on her own. Derek said, I will address this immediately. I said, how? Derek said, I will call an emergency board meeting. I said, when? Derek said, today, if possible. I said, good. Derek said, do not leave your property until I call you back. I said, I have to go to work. Derek said, can you work from home? I said, no. Derek said, then park your car in your garage and lock it. I said, I will. Derek hung up. I moved my car into my garage and locked the garage door. Then I called my supervisor and explained what was happening. He said, this is insane. I said, I know. He said, can you work a half shift today and make up the hours later? I said, yes. He said, do that. I said, thanks. He said, keep me updated. I said, I will. At 2, Derek called me back. He said, I just finished an emergency meeting with the board president and 2 other board members. Vanessa was not invited. We reviewed your complaint and the evidence you provided, including the city clerk letter. The board has decided to suspend Vanessa from the landscaping committee pending a full investigation. I said, "What about the fines?" Derek said, "The fines are rescinded." I said, "What about the lien?" Derek said, "There is no lien. Vanessa never filed the paperwork." I said, "She said she did." Derek said, "She lied." I said, "What happens to her now?" Derek said, "That depends on the investigation. If we find she violated the covenant or the law, the board can remove her permanently." I said, "Good." Derek said, "I am sorry this happened." I said it should not have gotten this far. Derek said, "I agree." I hung up and sat down. I felt exhausted. I had spent a week fighting Vanessa over nothing, and it had almost cost me my job and my car. I opened my laptop and drafted an email to the board president. I said I wanted a formal apology from the association and a guarantee that Vanessa would not be allowed to retaliate. I also said I wanted the board to adopt an enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics so this could not happen to another homeowner. I sent the email and waited. The board president replied an hour later. He said the board would issue a formal apology and that Vanessa had been instructed to have no contact with me. He said the board would discuss enforcement reforms at the next meeting and that my input would be welcome. I replied and said I would attend. 2 days later, I got a call from the city clerk. The clerk said I wanted to follow up on the ordinance clarification I sent you. Did it help? I said yes. It proved the HOA was misrepresenting the rule. The clerk said, "Good. I also wanted to let you know that the city received a complaint about snow route interference from your HOA and we are investigating." I said, "What kind of interference?" The clerk said, "Unauthorized towing threats and fake emergency declarations." I said, "Vanessa." The clerk said, "I cannot confirm that, but the complaint mentioned the same address you contacted me about." I said, "What happens now?" The clerk said, "If we find the HOA violated city ordinance, we will issue a written warning and possibly fines." I said, "Good." The clerk said, "Thank you for bringing this to our attention." I said, "Thank you for helping." The following week, I attended the board meeting. Vanessa was not there. The board president opened the meeting and said the board had completed its investigation into the landscaping committee. He said Vanessa had been removed from her position effective immediately. He said the board had adopted an enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics, including a requirement that all fines be approved by a majority of the board before they are issued, and a rule that no committee member can issue a tow authorization without written approval from the management company and the board president. He said the board was also implementing a new dispute resolution process that would give homeowners more time to respond to violations and more opportunities to appeal. The board president then read a formal apology on behalf of the association. He said the board regretted the way I had been treated and that the association was committed to fair and transparent enforcement going forward. Several other homeowners in the audience clapped. One person stood up and said, "This should have happened months ago." Another person said, "Vanessa has been harassing people for years." The board president said, "We acknowledge that, and we are taking steps to prevent it in the future." After the meeting, the board member who had spoken up during the suspended hearing came over to me. He said, "I am glad you did not back down." I said, "I almost did." He said, "But you did not. That matters." I said, "What happened to Vanessa?" He said, "She resigned from the board entirely. She is still a homeowner, but she has no authority now." I said, "Will she retaliate?" He said, "She might try, but she knows the city is watching, and if she does anything, the board will take action." I said, good. He said, you did the neighborhood a favor. A lot of people were too afraid to stand up to her. I said, I just wanted my car. He laughed and said, well, you got it. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from the city. It said the city had completed its investigation and had issued a written warning to the Millstone Terrace Association over snow route interference. The letter said the association had misrepresented city ordinances and had threatened unauthorized enforcement actions. It said the city would monitor the association for compliance and that further violations could result in fines. I made a copy of the letter and added it to my file. A month after that, I got an email from Derek. He said the board had hired a new landscaping committee lead and that the committee was operating under the new enforcement checklist. He said the association had received no new complaints since the reforms were implemented. He thanked me for my patience and said the association valued my input. I replied and said I appreciated the changes and that I hoped they would last. I never saw Vanessa again. Her car disappeared from her driveway a few weeks after the board meeting. My neighbor said she had moved out. I do not know if that is true, but I do not care. She is gone. And that is enough. The portable folding sign stand she used to place near my driveway ended up in the HOA office storage closet, and no one ever used it again. The city clerk confirmation that the HOA misrepresented an ordinance in writing became the trump card I deployed when I handed copies to my ally first. Then we presented together so Vanessa could not isolate me. Her credibility collapsed in front of witnesses when the board president read the city letter out loud at the management audit that exposed the pattern. She repeated a threat, and everyone heard it on the recording I had submitted to Derek before the meeting. The board adopted an enforcement checklist that limits Karen tactics, and the city issued a written warning over snow route interference. The HOA reversed policy to avoid fines. I kept every photo, every email, every notice, and every timestamp. I kept the notepad with the wet pages. I kept the printed city ordinance and the clarification letter. I kept it all in a tabbed binder in my office, and I will keep it for as long as I live here. Because the next time someone tries to abuse the rules, I will know exactly what to do. Take care, and I will catch you in the next one.